Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video. We're going to be looking today at the final years of Thomas Becket, also called Thomas of Canterbury, Thomas of London, or in some cases, Thomas à Becket. He was, in his final years, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who fell foul of assassins at the age of 52 in 1170, murdered within the walls of his own Canterbury Cathedral. This video is going to look at the last 10 years of his life, of which he was, of course, the Archbishop, but the final years in which he was the Chancellor of England under Henry II, the most trusted of his advisors. So let's get on with our story of the end of Thomas à Becket. Becket was born in late December of the year 1118 to a wealthy London merchant. But he didn't decide to follow in his father's footsteps, for he wanted a more pious and religious vocation, befitting of his own piety and character. He studied canon law in his youth across in the continent, over in France and Italy. And he came under the attention of the Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, the man known as Theobald of Bec. And it was Theobald who in 1155 had recommended to the King of England, Henry II, that Becket be given the position of Lord High Chancellor. The Lord Chancellor position was in essence a secretarial role. Becket was in charge of writing a lot of the royal correspondence, as well as drafting the more formal, judicious documents for King Henry II. He was also the keeper of the royal seal and, to a minor extent, an overseer of the finances of the royal coffers. But being a man of the clergy, a man of the church, as most Lord Chancellors were, Becket also served as the chaplain to King Henry II, consulting on any religious matters that befell the king's mind. As Lord Chancellor, Becket was able to reform the justice system. He settled a number of the disputes that the barons had amongst themselves, and that the barons had with the king as well. Their power was diluted, reduced, so that the king's power was increased to more absolute levels, and actually the tenants, of which worked on the lands that the barons owned, had a better relief system than had previously been afforded them. As Lord Chancellor, Becket became one of Henry II's most trusted of loyalists. That was until the year 1162, when Thomas à Becket became the Archbishop of Canterbury. Theobald of Bec passed away on the 18th of April 1161, leaving the position of Archbishop of Canterbury wide open for a number of different nominations. The Chief Justice, Richard de Lucy, was one of a number of people who nominated Thomas à Becket to become the next Archbishop. He had served Henry II so loyally as Lord Chancellor, surely the same would be said if he were the Archbishop. So, on the 24th of May 1162, he was elected as the Archbishop, consecrated in a formal ceremony just 3 days later, on the 27th. For the first year as Archbishop, Becket was to reside at Otford Palace, one of the numerous residences that the Archbishop was entitled to live in. Otford was roughly, give or take a few miles, equidistant between the capital of London, where obviously Henry II was, and also his diocese and his cathedral in Canterbury City. But this wasn't the first link to this small little village in the county of Kent for Thomas Becket, because in the year before he was made Chancellor, Lord Chancellor, he was also given a number of religious offices and titles, like the Archdeacon of Canterbury. And as part of these numerous different offices of religious importance for Theobald of Bec, he was given a number of benefices, which included the church at Otford. So Becket knew the area quite well. Becket may have been equidistant between the king and with God, in living in his home at Otford Palace, but in his mind and in his loyalties, he became closer to God following his appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury. This made things very, very difficult for King Henry II as we move into the year 1164. For it was on the 25th of January in that year that Henry convened a great council consisting of himself, a number of the barons of England, including the Chief Justice Richard de Lucy, and a number of important figures within the church, including, of course, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. They convened at a place called Clarendon, which is just outside of Salisbury, and it was there that Henry and the Chief Justice put forward a 16-point proposal known synonymously as the Constitutions of Clarendon. These constitutions tried to define, or in fact redefine, the roles and the powers that the church had and which the state had. These two seemingly separate entities in the Middle Ages who were trying desperately to work together and find compromise. Henry II was aiming to readjust this dynamic back to how it had previously been before the anarchy civil war of the Empress Matilda and King Stephen in the 1140s to early 1150s. Only about a third of these constitutions were actually accepted by members of the church. And Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was the most ardent critic of these constitutions of Clarendon. What Becket took most offence to was the jeopardisation of certain benefices within the church, the prospect of prosecuting religious criminals in civil law courts, and most definitely against Henry II manoeuvring himself as the head of the English Church, not breaking away with Rome and the Pope himself, but becoming the almighty overseer of religious matters as well as civil ones. Over the next 9 months, Becket refused to sign these new constitutions and openly quarrelled with the King of England. Both King and Archbishop would write separately to the Pope pleading that they get involved in this new situation. But the Pope, of course, didn't want to get involved. He hadn't seen the constitutions, so couldn't form an opinion. Henry then went on the counter-offensive, accusing Becket of fraud from when he was the Lord Chancellor of England between 1155 and 62. The trial of Becket was on the 20th of October 1164, where he was sentenced and found guilty and ordered to pay 2,000 marks to the king as a result of this fraud charge. Just 5 days following this sentencing, Becket almost considered paying the fine that he was ordered to pay King Henry. But at the very last minute, he decided to make a dash and escape from English soil and, of course, the royal wrath. He sailed from Sandwich towards the northern coast of France at a place called Gravelines, before making the rest of the journey towards his place of exile called Soissons. It would be a little over 5 years before Becket was able to step back onto English soil. In the January of 1165, Henry II decided to confiscate all of the property, all of the rights and privileges, all of the titles, and all other aspects to do with Becket and the Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1166, the Pope then decided to get involved. He had been given a copy of the Constitutions of Clarendon and understood the problems that came with this reforming document. He only agreed really with 6 out of the 16 points and clauses within the constitutions. The Pope decided to recognise or re-recognise Thomas à Becket as the Archbishop of Canterbury, because even if the King of England didn't, in the eyes of the Pope and in the eyes of God, it still mattered that Thomas à Becket was the Archbishop. And also the Pope granted Archbishop Becket the ability to give out a bit of papal justice and do something what is known as excommunication. This is a definition of excommunication. And he did that to Richard de Lucy, the Chief Justice, who had fought for Archbishop of Canterbury to become the Archbishop. And it was he who was the author, or one of the co-authors, to this Constitution of Clarendon. Thomas à Becket also excommunicated a man called Ranulph de Broc, who lived at Saltwood Castle down near Dover in Kent. And he was accused and excommunicated for confiscating a lot of the lands and estates that had once belonged to Canterbury and the Archbishop position. But as well as dispensing out a bit of papal justice, the Pope wanted to build back the bridges, bring about the peace again between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King of England. And after 3 or 4 years of toings and froings, another set of excommunications in 1169 to reinforce the previous ones 3 years ago, there was finally a meeting between Thomas à Becket and King Henry II at Fréteval in the July of 1170. On the 22nd of July 1170, Becket performed what was known as the Kiss of Peace. Compromises had been made on both sides, and so this gesture of goodwill was supposed to signify the striding towards the future in peace, and also a forgetting of the woes and worries that had been the last 6 years. It wouldn't be for another 4.5 months until Becket stepped foot onto English soil, that being the 1st of December 1170. Within a couple of days, Archbishop Becket rode through the streets of Canterbury to a jubilant crowd, publicly celebrating the fact of this return of a now beloved man of the church. But just a few short days after that, Becket was to make enemies once again with the nobles, with more men of the church, and unfortunately again with the King of England. Becket was informed of a small coronation service that had taken place 6 months previous, overseen by the Archbishop of York, the Bishop of London, and the Bishop of Salisbury. It was a coronation for Prince Henry, the oldest son to King Henry II. Henry II had spent most of his time and efforts living and residing in France. So, wanting a royal presence, a kingly presence in England, it was decided that young Prince Henry was to become the English king as well, living in England. It's all very complicated, I grant you. But this infuriated Thomas à Becket, because it's supposed to be the Archbishop of Canterbury that oversees all of these coronations for all the kings and queens of England. Even today, in the 21st century, it's always the Archbishop of Canterbury that oversees those ceremonies. So what does Becket do? Well, again, as I said, he made enemies. He decided to excommunicate all three of those bishops, the Bishop of York, London, and the Bishop of Salisbury. And now we get to the most famous point within the narrative of Thomas à Becket and his untimely demise. Picture the scene. Henry II is sitting in court in a town just outside of Bayeux in Normandy, France. He is informed by his advisors of what Becket is doing, his own Archbishop of Canterbury. He cries out with an enraged anger of passion and says, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" 4 knights take it upon themselves, following this outrage by the King of England, to sail from Bayeux to Dover. The purpose of these 4 knights was not to kill the Archbishop, though they would if they were forced. The idea was to threaten the Archbishop of Canterbury, to make him rescind his issues with these 3 bishops that he had excommunicated, to force him to swear loyalty to the King of England, and to never, of course, be a troublesome priest again. Now, whenever someone is in a furious bit of rage, people tend to say things that they don't necessarily mean. And so the King of England is no different to you or I. He had already sent on Christmas Day a number of commissioners to go and arrest the Archbishop of Canterbury for his actions within just a few short weeks of landing in England. They were told to go to Winchester first, to collect the young King Henry, who was holding his court there, and then travel across to Canterbury and arrest the Archbishop. But when King Henry II learnt that these 4 knights had gone rogue, he then ordered his commissioners to bypass Winchester altogether and go directly towards Canterbury. Go as fast as they could, try to catch up with these 4 rogue knights, maybe even beat them to the city limits. But unfortunately, these commissioners were far too slow. The knights made it to Canterbury on the 29th of December 1170. And after a great threatening interaction between knight and archbishop, the knights murdered and killed the Archbishop Thomas à Becket. And that is the conclusion to this video. I'm going to leave you on a bit of a cliffhanger here. Part 2 will go through Thomas à Becket's murder and the events surrounding it, the aftermath, and how Henry II recovers from this reputational damage at the most beloved man in 12th century England. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I shall see you for part 2 soon. Until then, see you later.